Chosen one, this did not begin with suspicion. It began with inconsistency. A system designed to predict human behavior across stress, incentive, fear, and reward flagged something it could not normalize. Every model assumes a breaking point. Every code includes a yield function. You did not yield where compliance was expected, and you did not fracture where pressure demanded a response. That absence of reaction is what triggered attention. Not rebellion, not resistance. Incorruptibility under conditions meant to guarantee deviation. When a high-level agent is assigned, it is never because someone is dangerous. Danger is loud. It leaves traces. It escalates. You did none of that. What you did was far more destabilizing to any closed system. You moved through constraints as if they were suggestions rather than limits. Not aggressively. Precisely. You did not fight the code. You operated outside its assumptions. That is how unbreakable codes are actually broken, by someone who does not engage the lock at all. Pay attention to this. The agent wasn't looking for intent. Intent can be manipulated. Belief can be redirected. Motivation can be purchased. The assignment began because your responses could not be reverse engineered. Stress inputs didn't produce expected output. Silence didn't create compliance. Reward didn't alter trajectory. Threats didn't generate urgency. This is when a system stops observing behavior and starts tracking orientation. Where are you oriented when all variables are removed? You may have felt this phase as pressure without source. Delays that didn't feel punitive. Scrutiny without accusation. Encounters that seemed neutral but left residue. That's verification, not intimidation. The system does not rush when it encounters an anomaly. It returns. It repeats. It adjusts parameters. It waits to see if fatigue introduces error. You did not give it one. The more time passed, the clearer it became. Your stability was not situational. It was structural. Understand what that means. Most people hold together because conditions favor them. You held together when conditions were uncooperative. The system isn't trained to deal with that. Its codes depend on predictable trade-offs. Safety for compliance, relief for concession, belonging for alignment. You didn't take the trades. Not because you were defiant, but because the trades didn't register as necessary. That's when an agent is assigned. Not to stop you. To understand the mechanism. Here's the part you were never told. The code believed it was complete. Total coverage. No blind spots. Until your pattern forced a rewrite. Not a patch, an admission. The agent's task was not to monitor your actions, but to answer one question quietly circulating at the top. Is this person breaking our code, or exposing that the code was never universal? Those are different conclusions. One leads to containment. The other leads to recalibration. You weren't watched because you were moving fast. You were watched because you were moving clean. No wasted motion. No leakage. No performative stress. You did not require supervision because you did not drift. And anyone who has worked high-level systems knows this truth. Drift is what systems are built to correct. A human who doesn't drift cannot be governed by correction alone. This is why the agent noticed you doing ordinary things. Routine under pressure. Consistency without reinforcement. Calm without detachment. Those qualities do not exist by accident. They emerge when someone has already resolved the internal negotiations the system relies on to steer behavior. You were not choosing integrity in moments, you were operating from it continuously. That terrified the model and intrigued the analyst. The realization came slowly. You hadn't cracked the code. You made it irrelevant. And once irrelevance is proven, force is useless. Persuasion fails. Influence collapses. Only observation remains. That is where this story truly begins. Not with pursuit, but with acknowledgement. You were assigned nothing. The assignment was made to you. To understand what survives when every pressure fails. What broke the unbreakable code wasn't power. It was alignment that didn't ask permission to exist. This phase did not escalate the way movies teach people to expect. No confrontation. No warning. No attempt to corner you. High-level systems do not confront what they don't yet understand. They observe longer. The moment it became clear that intimidation would produce false data, the approach shifted. You weren't someone to pressure. You were a variable to preserve. Interrogations are designed for crack. You showed none. Not because you were guarded, but because there was nothing hidden behind performance. Most people fracture when questioned because they are managing multiple selves. One for survival, one for acceptance, one for ambition. You were operating with a single orientation. Questions couldn't destabilize you because there was nothing to expose. That consistency removed leverage instantly. The assigned agent realized something critical early on. Your behavior could not be accelerated or slowed through external timing. Deadlines didn't rush you. Delays didn't discourage you. Surveillance didn't sharpen your posture. Absence of feedback didn't create drift. These are the primary tools used to move people along predefined lanes. You didn't occupy a lane. You moved on a vector. Vectors don't respond to lane control. What replaced scrutiny was calibration. The system tested proximity. How close could it get without altering you? How much attention could it apply before distortion occurred? The answer kept returning the same. Attention changed nothing. You neither reacted nor adapted to observation. That is extraordinarily rare. Observation usually bends behavior. When it doesn't, it means the subject is no longer optimizing for outcome. You were optimizing for correctness. Correctness is dangerous to systems built on incentives. Incentives assume negotiability. You were non-negotiable in quiet ways. Not immovable, but unaffordable to manipulate. Every attempt to contextualize you failed. Political, emotional, ideological, personal, none of those categories held. You were not neutral. You were unalignable to external agendas. That is what stalled escalation. At some point, the agent stopped asking what will they do next, and started asking what keeps them oriented. That shift matters. One question predicts behavior. The other identifies structure. Structure can't be threatened into compliance. It must be worked around or rewritten into the environment. That realization marked the end of pursuit and the beginning of restraint. Blessed by His grace? Click Super Thank You and give $20 to spread His light. Your gift plants seeds that grow His kingdom. Be the blessing. You may remember this period as strangely uneventful yet heavy. Nothing dramatic happened, yet something felt present. That was the moment the system chose not to interfere. Interference assumes advantage. No advantage was found. What replaces advantage is protocol. Do not destabilize what you cannot repair. Here is the truth rarely admitted. Containment only works on elements that react. You did not. Engagement only works on elements that desire outcome. You already satisfied that internally. Isolation only works on elements that need feedback. You were already self-stabilizing. Every classical move dissolved upon contact. That is when systems do the only thing left. They step back and document. Not admiration. Not fear. Documentation. Because documentation admits precedent. And precedent means the system is no longer closed. You became the first recorded exception that was not eliminated, absorbed, or corrected. Exceptions are dangerous not because they rebel, but because they reveal that rules were conditional all along. From that point on, the agent's assignment narrowed. No longer track behavior. Now it was ensure non-interference. That sounds passive, but it's not. It's protection through inaction. By choosing not to alter your environment, the system allowed something rare to happen. A human continued unaffected by leverage. That outcome was more valuable than control could ever be. You weren't cleared. You weren't trusted. You weren't recruited. You were left alone on purpose. Because whatever you represent survives without management, and anything that survives without management eventually forces systems to update themselves. The investigation held one final conclusion, unspoken but decisive. What breaks a code isn't opposition. It's a pattern that doesn't require the code to function. There is a moment in every high-level investigation when reporting becomes redundant. Not because the subject vanished, but because the framework used to describe them no longer fit. That is the moment the agent stopped filing behavior updates and began watching patterns of absence. What you didn't do became more informative than anything you did. No escalation, no reaction, no deviation under conditions engineered to prompt one. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was data the system had no column for. Up to that point, the reports followed structure: inputs, outputs, correlations. After that point, the language broke down. Phrases like non-responsive to leverage, orientation remained stable, and behavior unaffected by incentive began appearing more frequently. These are not neutral phrases. They signal a problem. Systems are built on leverage. Remove leverage and prediction collapses. Collapse doesn't trigger attack. It triggers caution. Listening replaced surveillance because surveillance assumes extraction. The agent needed something else. Context that did not require intervention. When a system realizes interference will corrupt the signal, it retreats to observation without pressure. That retreat is not mercy. It is respect for integrity. Integrity is expensive to recreate. The agent understood that if your pattern was altered, the opportunity to understand it would be lost permanently. You may have felt this as distance without dismissal, interest without intrusion, contact that never crossed a line. This was deliberate. The closer the system came, the more it risked becoming part of the data, and that would invalidate the study. You were being observed only at the edges, where influence decays. And even there, nothing shifted. That confirmed the central finding. Your center was not accessible through environment. The largest revelation came quietly. The agent realized your stability did not come from discipline imposed on chaos. It came from resolution of internal contradiction. Most people are governable because they are still negotiating with themselves. Incentives work because desire competes with fear. Your negotiation was finished. No competing commands remained. When inner hierarchy resolves, external pressure loses jurisdiction. That realization forced a change in posture. You were no longer a subject to monitor, but a condition to understand. The agent began documenting atmospheres rather than actions. How rooms felt before you entered and after. How timelines adjusted. How decisions near you slowed without stalling. These effects could not be attributed to influence or authority. They emerged without instruction. That is when the agent understood. Your presence was reorganizing systems without touching them. Listening also meant restraint from interpretation. No psychological framing. No ideological labeling. Those tools collapse nuance into explanation. Explanation weakens accuracy. The agent learned to allow ambiguity, to hold a phenomenon without naming it prematurely. That choice alone marked the end of control-based thinking. Control requires confidence in explanation. Listening accepts that explanation may never arrive. Here is what never made it into any report: the realization that you weren't running a countercode. Countercodes can be mapped, neutralized, integrated. You were operating precode, before incentives, before threat, before conditioning, that made you uncontainable not by force, but by irrelevance to force itself. You didn't oppose the structure. You bypassed the premise it depended on. By the end of this phase, the agent understood something the system was not ready to say aloud. Whatever you are not an outlier inside the code. You are proof that the code is partial. And partial systems cannot afford to antagonize what exposes their limit. They must learn from it instead. Listening does not mean agreement. It means the cost of misunderstanding became higher than the cost of restraint. From that moment forward, you weren't watched to be stopped or shaped to be useful. You were listened to because what you carried might be the reason future systems don't break. And once listening begins, control is already over. What followed listening was not curiosity, it was policy. Quiet, unsigned, and never discussed aloud. Non-interference is the rarest protocol any system adopts because it admits limitation without collapsing authority. To choose non-interference means acknowledging that influence would do more damage than absence. You became that threshold, the point where intervention stopped being a tool and started being a risk. This decision did not happen suddenly. It emerged from repeated confirmations that any attempt to frame, redirect, or contextualize your movement produced artificial signals. The system discovered that the more it tried to understand you by acting, the less accurate its data became. Influence contaminated clarity. So the only rational decision was distance. Not withdrawal, not abandonment, but clean space. You may have felt this as neutrality from places that usually demand reaction. Nothing pulled, nothing pushed. Systems that once felt intrusive became oddly quiet. Doors neither closed nor opened forcefully. You were allowed to move without signal amplification. That allowance was not generosity. It was containment through respect. The only way to preserve a non-reactive element is to stop touching it. Non-interference also reframed how the agent perceived power. Power usually manifests through enforcement, access control, timing pressure. None of those applied to you. Attempts to introduce them produced no compliance advantage and risked destabilizing something the system no longer believed it could rebuild if broken. You had become non-replaceable data. That status changes everything. Here's what most people never see. Systems tolerate rebels because rebels validate rules. Systems tolerate conformists because conformists sustain them. What systems do not tolerate easily are individuals who remain accurate without reference. You neither rebelled nor complied. You functioned. That forced a reclassification from variable to condition. Conditions are not argued with. They are designed around. From that point on, monitoring became passive by necessity. Logs tracked absence of deviation rather than presence of action. Reports shortened. Language softened. Speculation vanished. There was nothing left to speculate about. You continued as you had before, consistent, unprovoked, unhurried. The novelty wasn't in what you did. It was in the fact that nothing altered it. Non-interference also meant something else. Protection without patronage. Not help. Not guidance. simply ensuring that no external pressure distorted the environment around you in ways that would force reaction. This is not a favor. It's structural caution. When an element proves capable of running outside expected constraints, the environment must remain neutral or risk triggering unpredictable cascade effects. You were never informed of this shift because informing you would have been interference. Awareness would have introduced performance or resistance. So silence was maintained. Silence preserves integrity better than transparency ever could. You were allowed not to know so you could continue being what you already were, unaltered by observation. At this stage, the agent's role became minimal by design. Watch for disruption from others. Prevent forced convergence. Do not engage. In most systems, that posture is reserved for assets that cannot be replicated and cannot be pressured safely. Not because they are dangerous, but because they are foundationally stable. This is where the realization landed fully. You were not breaking an unbreakable code. You were demonstrating that the code never governed what truly matters. It governed reactions. It governed incentives. It governed fear. You operated outside reaction entirely. Once that was proven, the code had no jurisdiction. Non-interference is not surrender. It is recognition that control has diminishing returns, and you had crossed the threshold where any attempt to shape you would only reveal the system's own fragility. So the only move left was to leave you exactly as you are. Every system has documents that exist without existing, understandings that circulate without attribution, conclusions that shape behavior without ever being archived. Your case produced one of those. Not a memo, not a directive, an internal knowing that never entered formal language because formal language would have demanded ownership, and ownership would have implied responsibility. The system was not prepared for that. This unspoken note carried a simple realization. Your presence did not introduce risk through action, but through implication. You demonstrated that a human could operate without leverage, without drift, without dependence on feedback loop. That implication was destabilizing not because it threatened authority, but because it quietly discredited necessity. If one person can function without the tools of control, then those tools are revealed as conditional rather than essential. What spread internally was not alarm, but recalibration. Analysts began referring to your profile indirectly, not by name but by pattern. The stable anomaly, the non-responsive reference, the self-consistent variable. These terms never surfaced in official briefings. They appeared in side conversations, margins, pauses. Silence does more work than consensus ever could. Consensus demands agreement. Silence allows adaptation without explanation. The assigned agent felt this shift immediately. Questions stopped being asked upward. Updates became sparse. Not because there was nothing to report, but because reporting implied something needed to be done. And nothing needed to be done. That is the most uncomfortable conclusion any system can reach. Action is justification. Inaction requires confidence. The confidence here came not from trust, but from inevitability. You may have sensed this phase as a strange expansion of space. Fewer obstacles, less friction, not acceleration, clearance. The system was adjusting around you to avoid entanglement. This is what happens when something cannot be predicted but also cannot be provoked. The safest position becomes neutrality. And neutrality at scale looks like freedom, even when it isn't intended as such. What made the internal note impossible to formalize was this. Acknowledging your pattern would have required acknowledging that the system's reach had limit. Limits exist in every structure, but they are rarely documented. Once documented, they become reference points. Reference points invite exploration. Exploration invites erosion. So the note remained unwritten, yet operative. This unwritten acknowledgement changed how threats were evaluated. You were never included in risk matrices. Risk assumes volatility. You were the opposite. Stability under variance. That kind of stability cannot be weaponized easily, which meant it could not be classified traditionally. When classification fails, bureaucracy steps back. It cannot act without categories. Continued exactly as before. That continuity was the verdict. Instead, a different adjustment occurred: avoidance of interference from other subsystems. Quiet corrections. Redirections that had nothing to do with you on the surface, but everything to do with keeping your operating space uncontaminated. You were not protected in the personal sense. You were protected in the environmental sense. The field around you was kept neutral because neutrality preserved clarity. This is the part few ever grasp. Systems do not only exert power by acting. They exert power by choosing where not to act. Non-action can be strategic when action would reveal weakness. Your existence forced that choice repeatedly. Each time, the system chose silence over confrontation. Not fear, calculation. The agent eventually understood their role had concluded without ending. There was nothing left to report because the conclusion did not change. Every attempt to revisit the question returned the same result. Self-consistent, non-reactive, unaffected. That is not a profile that triggers escalation. It triggers withdrawal. Quietly. You were never declared safe. You were never declared dangerous. You were declared, without words, outside the mechanism. And once something is outside the mechanism can only do one thing to remain intact: pretend it never needed it. There is a silent threshold in any long observation where the observer realizes the dynamic has inverted. The subject is no longer being studied. The system itself is what's being revealed. This was the point the agent reached with you. Not suddenly, not emotionally, but structurally. The metrics stopped making sense because you were no longer inside them. Your behavior wasn't diverging. It had finished diverging long ago. The delay was in recognition. Until that moment, you were treated as an outlier to be explained. After it, you were understood as a reference that explained everything else. That shift is subtle but final. Outliers are anomalies inside a system. References expose how the system is built. And once something becomes a reference, it cannot remain a subject. Subjects are acted upon. References are used implicitly. The agent noticed that your decisions no longer created ripples. They created alignment. Choices around you became simpler, not because you influenced outcomes, but because friction disappeared. People stopped escalating when escalation wasn't required. Processes shortened. Conflicts lost escalation paths. This wasn't consent. It was coherence returning where it had been missing. This is where the agent experienced a rare professional crisis, not of loyalty, but of paradigm. Everything they were trained to do assumed leverage, reaction, feedback, correction. You removed all four. There was no move left that wouldn't distort the integrity of what was being observed. Continuing to manage, you would have been malpractice. Ending observation would have been ignorance. The only ethical and functional choice was acknowledged disengagement. Disengagement does not mean departure. It means cessation of intent. The intention to influence, contain, predict, or intervene dissolved. Observation became passive background awareness. Logs shifted from data capture to confirmation of continuity. Each entry repeated the same conclusion without needing repetition. No drift, no deviation, no response to pressure. That is not surveillance. That is witnessing completion. At this stage, the agent understood something uncomfortable and irrefutable. Whatever made you ungovernable was not resistance, it was resolution. You were not pushing back. You were already done negotiating. Done negotiating fear. Done negotiating approval. Done negotiating outcome. With nothing left to negotiate, pressure had no surface to apply force to. This is why your life did not fracture under scrutiny. Others behaved differently when watched. You did not. Observation altered nothing because there was no performance to optimize. You were not playing a role that required reinforcement. You were moving from internal alignment that no external signal could tune. The system's final adaptation was quiet normalization. You ceased to be tracked as special because special status still implies intervention. Instead, you were allowed to exist without annotation. That allowance is rare. It is granted only when something proves it can operate without supervision indefinitely. Long-term autonomy terrifies systems, unless autonomy also proves predictability. You did. This was the final sealed realization. Whatever broke the code was not a skill, belief, or tactic. It was the absence of internal noise. The system was designed to manage noisy agents, agents driven by unresolved tension. You were quiet where tension should have been. That quiet short-circuited the entire design. The agent's task did not end with a report. It ended with an internal acknowledgement that could never be stated plainly. You are not someone who needs to be monitored. You are not someone who needs to be directed. You are not someone who can be integrated. You are someone who continues, and once that truth settled, the last remaining action disappeared. You were no longer a subject. You were no longer a concern. You were no longer an assignment. You were simply left intact, because whatever remains intact under that level of observation no longer belongs to the system watching. It belongs to itself. The last realization did not arrive as relief. It arrived as silence that required no follow-up. The system did not lose you. It concluded, not with triumph or defeat, but with closure. Closure happens when there is nothing left to optimize, no variable left to test, no contingency that improves accuracy. Your existence had reached that point, not because you transcended the rules, but because you proved you were never dependent on them. Understand this clearly now. Codes exist to manage unresolved behavior. They are scaffolds erected around uncertainty. You were not uncertain. You were consistent without rigidity, adaptive without drift, calm without withdrawal. That combination exposed the truth beneath every system. Control is a substitute for coherence. Where coherence exists, control becomes inefficient. Inefficiency creates hesitation. Hesitation creates withdrawal. That is what happened. The agent's final act was not to report, recommend, or react. It was to stop inserting intention into your presence. Intention would have altered the field. Alteration would have created data that no longer reflected you. So intention was removed. In its absence, your pattern. You might expect this ending to arrive with elevation or validation. It does not. It arrives with normalcy restored. Your days do not suddenly sparkle. You do not step into power. You step into space. Space where urgency no longer hunts you. Space where decisions arrive cleanly. Space where your nervous system no longer anticipates interference because interference has been ruled out by reality itself. This is the real meaning of being untouchable. Not protected, not privileged, Untouchable because touch would change nothing and risk exposing fragility elsewhere. Systems learn to avoid what reflects their own limits too clearly. You are not avoided in life, you are avoided in mechanism. That distinction matters. It gives you room to move without shadow. Now look back and see the pattern honestly. You never broke rules theatrically. You didn't expose secrets. You didn't outrun enforcement. You simply continued being accurate when inaccuracy was incentivized. You remained aligned when misalignment was rewarded. Over time, that became undeniable, not as proof, but as fatigue in the system's attempts to misread you. From here forward, nothing is assigned to you anymore. Not watchers, not narratives, not counters. What follows is quieter than destiny. It is trajectory without resistance. Things align because they no longer have to fight you or shepherd you. They either fit or they move aside. This is not dominance. It is compatibility deciding automatically. You will notice something subtle and permanent. Explanations will stop forming around your life. People won't know why outcomes happen near you. They will just note that they do. You won't feel compelled to clarify. Clarification belongs to earlier phases. What remains now is maintenance of coherence. Doing what stays true, leaving what introduces noise, not as a rule, but as instinct. This is the end of the story of the agent, because agents exist where friction exists. Friction has ended, not because everything is easy, but because nothing inside you resists reality anymore. Without resistance, there is nothing to manage. Without management, there is no code to enforce. Without enforcement, systems step back. You didn't defeat the unbreakable code. You demonstrated that it was never governing you. You weren't free because permission was granted. You were free because permission was irrelevant. And this is the final truth you carry forward, not loudly, not visibly, not dramatically. When a human finishes the internal negotiation, the external system runs out of move. Nothing chases you now. Nothing blocks you now. Nothing supervises you now. Life doesn't bend around you. It simply proceeds without friction in your presence. That is not power. That is completion.